Well, hello and welcome back to the Screwtape Letters, Lesson 4, Letters 7 through 9 is what we'll be looking at today. Screwtape Letters, written by C.S. Lewis, published as magazine articles beginning in 1940 and published in book form 1942. And we'll always make mention of the fact that whenever you read the Screwtape Letters, you have to reorient your thinking and remind yourself as you read them that you're reading the correspondence, the imaginary, fictional correspondence between Screwtape, a senior demon, and a junior demon, his nephew, named Wormwood. One of the things I may have mentioned in the introductory lesson is that writing these letters, writing this book, took a toll on Lewis. I mean, it actually got him depressed at points. He had to step away from it, I think, at times, because he was, having to force himself to think as an enemy of God would think. And so as we read this together, as I read quotes, we're always trying to keep in mind that we're more or less thinking backwards about the Christian life, because we're looking at it through the eyes of an enemy of God, demonic forces. Screwtape writing to Wormwood. Well, our first letter of the three we're going to consider today is letter 7, and I would entitle that letter Extremes. Extremes. Really, this letter begins with a thought that's picked up from the preface to the book related to whether it's better for humans from a demonic perspective to believe or to disbelieve in the reality of the supernatural and the reality of demonic forces. And Screwtape says to Wormwood, he says, our policy for the moment is to conceal ourselves. And of course, this has not always been so, is what he says. But so right now, he says, we're trying to just keep people away from any idea that there are spiritual realities beyond the material world. We read in that letter, if we can produce our perfect work, the materialist magician, and again, this goes back to the preface, that we can combine one who's a materialist and one who thinks all I see is all there is, with the magician who's hyper interested, we might say, in the demonic. We want the mixture of the two. He says, so let me start again. If we can produce our perfect work, the materialist magician, the man not using but veritably worshiping what he vaguely calls, quote, forces, while denying the existence of spirits, then the end of the war is in sight. In other words, we'll have won. If we can just keep mankind having this vague notion of spirituality that it's more or less impersonal, Screwtape says that's the sweet spot. That's where we want to be. And it just reminded me of the whole idea of spiritualism. I've been to Asheville, North Carolina, where this spiritualism is rampant. You can buy crystals, and people are all involved in that type of thinking. Or the use of tarot cards, if I'm saying that right, T-A-R-O-T, tarot cards. Like these cards can somehow predict the future. I mean, there's this idea of spiritualism. I mean, when I read that quote from letter 7, I couldn't help but think of the Force of Star Wars. I mean, I don't know if there are people who actually buy into that, but I think it is a take on Eastern mysticism, that there's this force that can be, it's dualism, because the force can be good or evil, and it's one's not more powerful than the other. That's the kind of thing that Screwtape says is that's, if we can get people there, we've won. Believe that it's just spiritual forces that are impersonal. I like this quote. If any feigned suspicion of your existence begins to arise in his mind, in the patient's mind, suggest to him a picture of something in red tights and persuade him that since he cannot believe in that, it is an old textbook method of confusing them, he therefore cannot believe in you. He says, Give him the ludicrous picture. The red tights, the horns, the pitchfork, the tail with a fork. Get him to believe in that, or have him say to himself, "There's no way I can buy that," and therefore I can't believe in demonic forces at all. There's a sign if you travel I-65 in Alabama between Montgomery and Birmingham. There's a sign that's been by the side of that interstate as long as I can remember that says, "Go to church or the devil will get you." And there is the classic picture of a being in red tights with the horns and pitchfork. And I cringe when I see it, because that type of imagery is your secularist, you're a non-Christian would look at it and say, if that Christians believe in that kind of foolishness, that they've lost their minds. But let's also acknowledge that to affirm that evil is real and it's personal, and there's a being called that the Bible refers to as the devil, as the accuser, as the evil one, a fallen angel from Scripture. People think that's ludicrous, but the Bible teaches that Jesus dealt with him and defeated him. Of course, the Bible teaches that God came and took on human flesh in the form of his Son, the Lord Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, who lived a perfect life, who died in the place of sinners, who rose bodily from the grave. I mean, that's a wonderful claim itself, but it's attested to in Scripture and certainly in history. Well, Screwtape then in letter 7 returns to this whole idea of patriotism versus pacifism, and he's he's wanting to encourage extremes, either one or the other. You need to get your patient to pursue either extremes. But here's what I would call the money quote on extremes. He says, "All extremes," writes Screwtape, "except extreme devotion to the enemy," and he's referencing God, and that's from Screwtape's perspective. So let me start again. "All extremes, except extreme devotion to the enemy, are to be encouraged." All extremes. I mean, just think about that. How often our friends, neighbors, co-workers, family members, they easily give themselves to extremes. Extreme interest in a hobby or a sports team or a political party. People easily give themselves to extremes. It reminds me of the quote. I want to believe it's G.K. Chesterton. I didn't research it before I put it in my notes, but I believe it was Chesterton who said, "When people stop believing in God, it's not that they won't believe. It's not that they believe in nothing. It's that they'll believe in anything." When people stop believing in God, it's not that they believe in nothing. It's that they'll believe in anything. And I think that's true. I think we see that all around us. This whole notion that keeps popping up in this day and time that you hear quite often. I don't believe in religion. I don't believe in faith. I believe in science. Well, really, that's just another faith, another misplaced trust. Well, Screwtape goes on to say in that same letter how the goal is to see the church devolve into really just a special interest group of like-minded people. He says in this letter, "We want the church to be small, not only that fewer men may know the enemy, but also that those who do may acquire the uneasy intensity and the defensive self-righteousness of a secret society or a clique." We want it small so that fewer people know God from his perspective, the enemy, but also that it's kept small and you've got this small group of like-minded people, and so it's just it requires the ethos, if you will, of a secret society or a clique, a sect type of mentality. He says that's always something we want. We say as a church we want to be we want to hold to our beliefs and hold firm to the truth of the gospel, but not be sectarian, not have this we've got a corner on the market. I mean, for that reason, we want to pray for all Bible believing churches that are faithful to the Scriptures and faithful to the gospel. And so Screwtape then says to Wormwood, look, you need to, it seems in your particular instance, you ought to push them toward pacifism. Push them toward pacifism. And he says, and regardless, whether it's pacifism or patriotism, or I can hear the British patriotism, Lewis, through Screwtape, says, have the patient view his political views as part of his religion. And I was reading that section, and I thought Lewis did a good job of what we say threading the needle. Lewis is not saying in the Screwtape Letters, as some might want us to believe, that faith should have no part in how we vote, or faith should have no part in politics. Well, that's not true. We have to take our faith into every arena of life, and faith should inform how we vote. Our biblical convictions should inform how we live our lives. It should inform how we vote. But what Lewis, I think, is writing against here in the Screwtape Letters is not using not letting that our political extremes don't use faith as a cover. Well, and here's the quote I think that helps. Let me just quote from Screwtape Letters. Once you have made the world an end, the world an end, and faith a means, you have almost won your man. And it makes very little difference what kind of worldly end he is pursuing, provided that meetings, pamphlets, policies, movements, causes, and crusades matter more to him than prayers and sacraments and charity. He is ours. And the more religious, on those terms, the more securely ours. I could show you a pretty cage full down here in hell, is what he's saying. So, again, he says, provided that meetings, pamphlets, policies, movements, causes, and crusades matter more to him than prayers and sacraments and charity, he is ours. That's what he's getting at, is that we need to make the gospel, to put the right spin on it, the right perspective, that's a better word. We need to make the gospel, our faith, the end, right? I mean, our faith is not icing on life's cake. It's the cake itself. That's the point. Our faith, our belief in the gospel, that supersedes everything. And so and it should inform the way we vote, the way we approach policy and politics and government, we don't want to bathe our political commitments with a veneer of spirituality. And we mentioned this, I think, in the last lesson. Never want to equate a political party with our faith. It's not that one party or another could do a better job of adhering or promoting biblically informed policy. That's not what we're saying. But we're just saying, here's what we're saying. It's like when Joshua, before he went to Jericho, met the angel of the Lord. And Joshua, as I paraphrase, are you on our side or their side? And the angel of the Lord says, neither. I'm on the Lord's side. That's what we're saying. That's the perspective. So letter 7 deals with extremes. Letter 8, the next letter, I entitled it Undulation. Undulation, letter 8. A few years ago, Focus on the Family came out with a dramatized version of the Screwtape Letters, and they hired and used Andy Serkis to do the voice of Screwtape. And if you're familiar with the Lord of the Rings films, you know who Andy Serkis is. He was the voice of Gollum, who was a CGI creation in the films. But Andy Serkis did a great job. I commend the Screwtape Letters Focus on the Family version. I meant to bring it and hold it up for the video, but you can certainly Google it. But what is undulation? I can hear Andy Serkis saying that word, undulation, the way he said it. Well, undulation is the action of moving slowly up and down. And so undulation, as Screwtape describes it, is something natural for the humans. It's natural for you and I. In other words, we go through, and again, to use Screwtape's language, we go through peaks and troughs. A life is, the life we live this side of eternity, being a fallen world, is not a constant peak. Now, we certainly know that right now. We've not experienced troughs before. We're experiencing them at the moment in a variety of ways. Well, Screwtape describes, again, I'll quote him on undulation. He says, it's periods of emotional and bodily richness and liveliness that alternate with periods of numbness and poverty, all right? So it's periods of emotional and bodily richness and liveliness, the good times, that alternate with periods of numbness and poverty, the bad times, the hard times. But listen to Screwtape's observation about the troughs. He says that some of his, speaking of God's, the enemies from Screwtape's perspective, some of his special favorites have gone through long and deeper troughs than anyone else. Some of his special favorites have gone through longer and deeper troughs than anyone else. And so what Screwtape is saying in his own backwards way is God uses troughs a great deal. And when I read that quote, speaking of his special favorites, that's from a Screwtape perspective. That's not necessarily reality that God has favorites, but I thought about, to get to the point, I thought about C.H. Spurgeon, Charles Spurgeon, who dealt with severe depression. In fact, one of my favorite books is Spurgeon's Sorrows by Zach Eswine, talking about Spurgeon's fight with depression and how God has done that. There are a number of godly pastors and leaders who fought with who were in difficult times. How has God used troughs, the low times in your life? How's he using it now? I think that's a good question to be asking ourselves. Now, there are a lot of great quotes in this particular letter. Let me read this one. One must face the fact, again, here's Screwtape, one must face the fact that all the talk about his love for men and his service being perfect freedom is not, as one would gladly believe, mere propaganda, but an appalling truth. He really does want to fill the universe with a lot of loathsome little replicas of himself, creatures whose life, on its miniature scale, will be qualitatively like his own. Not because he has absorbed them, but because their wills freely conform to his. We want cattle who can finally become food. He wants servants who can finally become sons. Let me read that again. We want cattle who can finally become food. He wants servants who can finally become sons. Well, Screwtape closes the letter complaining about how frustrating it is when people are still faithful to the Lord, even in the troughs of life. This is another good quote. Do not be deceived, Wormwood. Our cause is never more in danger than when a human, no longer desiring, but still intending to do our enemy's will, looks round upon a universe from which every trace of him, that is God, seems to have vanished, and asks why he has been forsaken, and he still obeys. I'm going to read that last sentence again. Our cause is never more in danger than when a human, no longer desiring but still intending to do our enemy's will, looks round upon a universe from which every trace of him seems to have vanished, and asks why he has been forsaken, and still obeys. He says that's when our cause is in the most in danger. And it reminds me of the illustration scene from The Silver Chair, when Prince Aurelian is freed from that chair that holds him captive, and Puddleglum the Marshwiggle and Eustace Scrubb and Jill Pole are wrestling with whether they should release him or not. And they've been told that the first person who asked them to do something in the name of Aslan was something that they must obey. Aslan himself had told them this. This was a sign. And under those circumstances, they didn't know whether they should let Prince Aurelian go or not, because he asked them to let him out of the chair. And he said, I implore you by the name of Aslan. And Puddleglum makes this great quote. He says, look, We weren't told what would happen when we obeyed the signs. We were just told to obey them. And so they do, and they free the prince. So, letter 8 is undulation, the peaks and troughs. Well, letter 9, we'll finish with this one, and we'll be rather brief here, but letter 9 I would entitle pleasure. Letter 9 is pleasure. And this has one of my favorite quotes out of the whole collection of letters, the whole book. The letter begins with Screwtape speaking of the trough of dullness or dryness that the patient's experiencing. He says, look, this is a great time to take advantage of this for the sake of temptation. And he says, particularly in the area of sexual temptation. And that leads him, Screwtape, in writing this letter to Wormwood, to reflect on the whole concept of pleasure. And so let me read you this quote. He says, never forget when we are dealing with any pleasure in its healthy and normal and satisfying form, we are, in a sense, on the enemy's ground. Okay, we're thinking like Screwtape. I know that we have won many a soul through pleasure. All the same, it is his invention, not ours. He made the pleasures. All our research so far has not enabled us to produce one. All we can do is to encourage the humans to take the pleasures which our enemy has produced, at times or in ways or in degrees which he has forbidden. Hence, we always try to work away from the natural condition of any pleasure to that in which it is least natural, least redolent or strongly suggestive of its maker, and least pleasurable. So Screwtape's saying, look, all we can do is mimic and twist pleasure. Anything pleasurable are God's gifts. At your right hand, the psalmist says, are pleasures forevermore. God is the source of all that's good, all that's joyful, all that's truly pleasurable. Even in the area of sexual intimacy, that's his design, that's his gift. And he says the right way to enjoy the gift is in God's covenant of marriage between one man and one woman. And when we open that gift, if you will, outside of the context in which God intended, then we're exploiting and abusing his gifts. And there can be tremendous fallout on family structures and even on culture and society. So I think that's helpful. Sometimes for those that may have grown up in a strict, there's at times, if we're not careful, let me put it this way, we may come to think, oh, if I enjoy that, then it must not be good. And that's wrong. You know, that whole thing, it's sinfully delicious. You ever heard that phrase, sinfully delicious? I mean, that's a warped perspective. If something is delicious, oh, taste and see the Lord is good. Something that's delicious is a gift from God. The pleasure of a marriage, the pleasure of a friendship, the pleasure of a sunset, all those things are God's pleasures. And he intends for us to enjoy the world he's made and enjoy pleasures as he's made them. It's the evil one's strategy to twist those pleasures and encourage their experience in ways or degrees which he has forbidden outside the most pleasurable way. So here we've thought through letters 7 through 9. Next time, lesson 5 will be letters 10, 11, and 12. 10, 11, and 12 for next time. Thanks for being with me.